The day Margaret Jennings tried to claim my forest trail as HOA common property was the day she lit a fuse she couldn't put out. I'm Damon Carter. I've lived in Ridgegrove Hills for 14 years. I'm not flashy, not loud, I just mind my own business. I work as a surveyor for the county, which means I know land boundaries better than most people know their own birthdays. That forest trail behind my lot, I built it, cleared it, maintained it, and it's on my deeded land, not some made-up shared space like Margaret claimed. Margaret, the HOA president, is exactly what you'd expect mid-50s, sharp bob haircut, and a personality that could sour milk. She once fined a guy for having a non-compliant shade of beige on his porch furniture. Now she had her eyes on my trail. It started on a Saturday morning when I saw her and two other board members, Ron and Kathy, walking up the trail with clipboards like they were on safari. I stepped off my back deck. "Can I help you?" Margaret didn't even glance my way, just inspecting the trail. "We're adding it to the HOA maintenance plan. This is technically common property." I raised an eyebrow. "No, it's not. That trail runs entirely through the rear part of my lot. You can check the plat map." She gave me that tight-lipped fake smile. "I'm sure you believe that, Damon. But the HOA has decided it's accessible to all residents. It's been used by others for years. That makes it communal by precedent." "Precedent doesn't trump title," I said flatly. "And unless the HOA bought this land when I wasn't looking, you're trespassing." Ron muttered something about calling their lawyer. Margaret held up a hand. "We'll be issuing a notice. You can appeal through the board. Appeal on my own property." That's when I knew this was more than just HOA overreach, this was personal. Margaret had been trying to push out long-timers like me for years, hoping to turn Ridgegrove Hills into her Stepford dream, so I waited. Let them put their nonsense in writing. 3 days later, I got a letter official HOA stationery declaring the trail a shared amenity and informing me that, effective immediately, I was not allowed to restrict access or modify the path. They even threatened a fine of $200 per day for obstruction. I laughed out loud. Then I got to work. First, I pulled my property records from the county database. Then I printed out the plat map, the registered survey, and the original development plans from 20 years back. Everything showed the same thing. That trail was entirely on my land. I didn't reply to the letter. Instead, I installed a 6-foot privacy fence along the back end of my property with a locking gate. On the gate, I hung a laminated sign. "Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." It took less than 24 hours for Margaret to show up, practically foaming at the mouth. She marched up to the fence like she was Queen of England. "You can't do this," she barked. "You're cutting off neighborhood access." I stepped out of my garage holding a folder. "You mean to my property? Here's every document proving this land is mine. You want to keep pushing it, I'll happily file a cease and desist, then a civil suit for trespass." Margaret's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before. "You're being unreasonable." "No," I said calmly. "You are. And the next time you or anyone from the board steps foot back there, I'll call the sheriff." She stormed off, muttering something about selfishness and community spirit. But here's the kicker: within a week, word got around that the nature trail was closed. Families who bought homes near mine had relied on that trail as a selling point. Real estate agents stopped showing those houses. One neighbor actually told me their buyer backed out after hearing the trail was private property and permanently closed. Then came the appraisal drops. Turns out, without the trail access, the homes backing my lot dropped in value by over $50,000 each. And suddenly, Margaret wasn't just angry, she was desperate. The next sign something big was brewing came when a white SUV with tinted windows parked outside my house and sat idling for 20 minutes. No one got out. It wasn't a neighbor's vehicle, and it wasn't any delivery or utility trucks I recognized. I didn't approach, I just walked back inside and reviewed the footage from the security cameras I'd installed last year, which now covered every angle of my home and the trail entrance. I made a note of the plates. Ran them through a friend of mine at the sheriff's department. He owed me a favor after I helped survey flood zones across his family's farmland during a storm season. The SUV was registered to a private real estate consulting firm based 2 counties over. Not exactly the kind of outfit that just happens to cruise into a quiet suburb. I didn't like the look of it. The next afternoon, a courier knocked on my door and handed me a thick packet with a rubber band around it. Inside was something absurd, a demand to cede easement rights, drafted by the HOA's legal rep. They claimed that because a few joggers had routinely accessed the trail from adjacent properties over the past 5 years, the HOA had standing to demand a permanent right-of-way. They wrapped it in legal jargon and tried to make it sound official, but it was a bluff. A sloppy, desperate bluff. I didn't bother replying directly. I forwarded the whole mess to my attorney, a woman named Lacey I'd worked with before on a boundary dispute with a neighboring town. She knew land law like it was poetry. Her response was immediate and unambiguous. They're bluffing. There's no legal basis for a forced easement when the usage was never granted by the landowner. They're gambling that you won't want the cost and hassle of fighting it. I told her to respond with a formal cease and desist letter and include an invoice for unauthorized use of private land, retroactively calculated based on market value for trail access. We weren't playing games anymore. 2 days later, Margaret showed up again, this time not alone. With her was a man in a gray blazer, square jaw, and enough cologne to fumigate a barn. He introduced himself as Greg Lawton, HOA legal counsel. He tried the charm route, called me Mr. Carter, complimented my landscaping, and asked if I had a few minutes to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. I stood on my porch with my arms crossed. "You don't need my permission to talk," I said, "but if you're going to try and finesse me like I've never seen a plat map before, don't waste your breath." He smiled like he was used to courtrooms and suits with too many buttons. "Here's the thing, Damon. The HOA can't afford to see property values continue to slide. The lack of trail access has created serious concern among homeowners. They're looking at me to deliver a resolution." "Then tell them to buy their own forest and dig a path," I said, "because this one's mine. And I'm not leasing it, I'm not selling it, and I'm not granting access." Margaret stepped in, her voice tight. "You don't understand the damage you're doing to this community?" "No, Margaret," I said. "You don't understand the damage you've already done by trying to confiscate someone else's land." Greg raised a hand. "What if we offer to maintain the trail at HOA expense? Liability coverage, landscaping, cleanup, the works. You retain ownership, but you allow shared access." "Let me see if I have this right," I said. "You want me to let dozens of people wander through my land so you can make a few columns on a spreadsheet look better, and in return you'll mow it?" I didn't wait for a response. I stepped back inside and closed the door. That evening I found my mailbox hanging open, its hinge bent, the door cracked where someone had jammed it backward. I reported the vandalism, filed a police report, and submitted video of a figure in a hoodie approaching the box just before midnight. The footage wasn't clear enough to make an ID, but I had a hunch who was behind it. 36 hours later, I received a notice from the county zoning office. Apparently, an anonymous source had submitted a complaint that the fence I installed violated height restrictions and encroached on setback limits. I dealt with the inspector personally, walked him to the boundary line, and showed him the original survey. He took one look at the paperwork, shook his head, and muttered something about wasting tax dollars. The next day, my neighbor, a single mom named April who lived 2 houses down, knocked on my door. She looked uneasy. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said. "I thought you should know." Margaret came by yesterday and asked if I'd be willing to sign a petition declaring the trail as a public necessity. She said it could help the HOA file for something called prescriptive easement. I leaned against the doorframe. "Did you sign it?" She shook her head. "No." I told her it felt shady, and after what you've been put through, I'm not helping her. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Margaret was escalating. She was trying to manufacture legal standing one doorstep at a time. I printed flyers that night. Know your property rights across the top, followed by clear bullet points about easement law, prescriptive use, and how signing anything without understanding the legal implications could put your property at risk. I included a QR code linking to a public website I built detailing the entire situation, including the trail's location, deed history, and every legal document I'd filed so far. By the weekend, nearly every mailbox on the street had one. And just like that, the tide started to turn. One neighbor, an HVAC tech named Joel, knocked on my door with a six-pack and said he'd been waiting for someone to finally stand up to those weasels. Another, a retired firefighter named Ken, offered to help me install floodlights along the fence and extend the camera coverage. They weren't just angry about the trail nonsense, they were fed up with years of fines for things like leaving garbage cans out for more than 2 hours or planting roses instead of approved greenery. Then came the bombshell. Lacey called me after digging into the HOA's financials, which were required to be public under state law. "Damon," she said, "you're not going to believe this. The HOA has been using maintenance funds to pay for legal counsel against you. That's a misuse of funds under the Civil Code." I didn't respond right away. They're paying Greg Lawton over $15,000 out of a line item marked Trail Development Consulting. That's not allowed unless it was approved through a public vote. It hadn't been. I checked the last 6 quarterly meeting minutes. No mention of it. No approval. Just a quiet reallocation of funds they assumed no one would notice. That's when I knew this wasn't just an overreach, it was fraud. I contacted the county district attorney's office. They referred me to the Public Integrity Unit. I handed them everything. Documents, invoices, the security footage, the mail vandalism report, and a signed affidavit from another neighbor who'd been pressured into signing a false declaration about the trail's use. The investigation moved fast. 3 weeks later, Margaret was served with a subpoena. Greg Lawton received one 2 days after. The HOA board was forced to hold an emergency meeting in the community clubhouse. They tried to bar non-board members from attending, but that didn't fly when half the neighborhood showed up with printouts of the HOA bylaws in hand. Margaret walked in late, looking paler than usual, and sat stiffly at the end of the table. When she tried to call the meeting to order, Joel stood up in the back and shouted, "No, you don't get to talk. We're not moving forward until someone explains why our dues are being used to sue a homeowner." The room erupted. Margaret tried to maintain control, but her voice faltered. Kathy, the treasurer, looked like she wanted to vanish into her chair. Ron didn't even show up. That night, the board voted to suspend all legal action and refund the diverted funds. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the investigation was just getting started. 2 weeks after the emergency meeting collapsed into chaos, I got a call from Detective Lynn of the county's Financial Crimes Division. His tone was clipped but polite, the kind of voice that made it clear he didn't waste time with nonsense. "We've completed the preliminary audit," he said. "What you uncovered wasn't just bad bookkeeping. There's evidence of fraudulent misappropriation of dues, falsified voting records, and unauthorized legal expenditures. This isn't just civil, there's criminal exposure here." I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the now locked gate beyond the tree line. "Are you pursuing charges?" "That part's up to the DA," Lynn said, "but we're recommending felony counts for at least 2 board members." The financial trail is ugly. We're also interviewing residents who were told to sign statements under false pretenses. That could turn into witness tampering. I thanked him and hung up, my heart steady. I wasn't surprised, just vindicated. The next morning, I noticed something different about the HOA bulletin board near the neighborhood entrance. It was empty. Not blank. Empty. Someone had torn the glass case clean off, screws still dangling from the posts. It was subtle, but the message was clear. The board was unraveling. I spent the day walking the trail behind my property, the one I had every legal right to enjoy in peace. Birds flitted through the canopy, and the air smelled of pine and wet soil. I'd forgotten how calming it was without HOA board members skulking through it with clipboards and veiled threats. Later that evening, a knock came at my door. It was Brian, a former Marine who lived across the street. He'd always kept to himself, but now he stood there with a folded paper in his hand. "I'm organizing a recall vote," he said. "Enough people are fed up. We've got the signatures for a special election enough to dissolve the board if we want." I opened the door wider. "You sure you want to lead that charge? I didn't serve in 2 combat zones to be bossed around by someone who thinks tulip bulbs are a crime," he said. "This neighborhood's been under their thumb for too long." He handed me the petition, and I signed without hesitation. 3 days later, flyers began appearing on porches, this time not from the board, but from residents. People were stepping up. April, the single mom who'd warned me about Margaret's petition stunt, was now organizing a community forum. Joel offered his garage for the meeting space. Ken, the retired firefighter, brought coffee and folding chairs. The forum drew more neighbors than any HOA meeting had in years. People were angry, but more than that, they were ready. Ready to take back control. Margaret didn't show, neither did Kathy. But Greg Lawton did. He stood at the back, arms folded, clearly there to monitor, not to participate. Brian stood at the front, holding the microphone. "We have a right to elect a board that actually represents us. Not one that hides financial records, ignores bylaws, and harasses homeowners over fences or garden gnomes." Applause erupted. Greg looked unimpressed. Someone in the back, an older man named Harold, raised his hand. "What happens if the DA files charges? Do we just replace them and move on?" April stood. "If charges are filed, we'll push for a full audit. Every dollar, every vote, every backroom deal, we clean house." That night, the community voted, not officially yet, but the momentum was undeniable. The recall petition had over 70% support. A special election was inevitable. The next week, the real bomb dropped. Lacey forwarded me a court filing. The district attorney had filed criminal charges against Margaret and Kathy. 3 felony counts: fraud, misuse of public funds, and coercion of community members under false legal claims. Greg Lawton was named as an unindicted co-conspirator, pending further investigation. I forwarded the filing to Brian. By noon, it was printed and posted at the neighborhood entrance, taped to every mailbox and circulating online. There was no more room for denial. That same day, 2 squad cars rolled into Ridgegrove Hills. Officers walked straight to Margaret's house. She refused to come to the door, but after 5 minutes, they entered with a warrant. We watched from a respectful distance, no cheering, no gloating, just quiet satisfaction. The next board meeting was held under police supervision. Interim members appointed by vote at the community forum took their seats. Brian was voted in as president, April as secretary. Joel volunteered as treasurer. No more secrecy, no more threats disguised as community values. Later that week, as I walked the trail again, I saw a group of kids building a small fort near the base of an old oak tree. Their dad waved from the edge of the woods. "Trail looks great," he said. "Glad it's yours, honestly, safer that way." I nodded. "It'll stay that way." As I turned back, I noticed something half buried near the edge of the trail, an old, weathered signpost. Faded text read, "Proposed common pathway pending permission." It had never been approved, just wishful thinking from the original developers. Margaret must have found it and spun a whole fairy tale around it. Poetic, really. That weekend, the new board held a block party, no agenda, no fines, no sign in sheets, just food trucks, music, and neighbors talking like neighbors again. I manned the grill with Ken while Brian ran crowd control on a rogue piñata that had nearly taken out a lawn chair. Later, Lacey stopped by to drop off a final packet of documents. "Civil case is closed," she said. "You're off the hook for everything." And the DA says Margaret's looking at a plea deal, no HOA involvement ever again. I raised a toast with my iced tea. To boundaries, I said. She smiled. To neighborhoods that remember what community actually means. The HOA still existed technically, but it no longer controlled people. It served them, and my trail, still mine, still locked, still peaceful just the way I built it. By the time summer crept in, Ridgegrove Hills had changed. The air felt lighter. Kids played on front lawns again. Neighbors greeted each other without glancing over their shoulders. But the final chapter of the Margaret debacle wasn't quite over. 3 weeks after the recall vote, I received a call from a local investigative reporter named Talia Grange. She'd been tipped off about the HOA's attempt to seize private property and misuse of funds. She wanted to do a full segment on it for the city's Sunday evening news. I hesitated at first. This wasn't about publicity, but she wasn't interested in fluff. "I'm not here to sensationalize," she said. "I want people to see how unchecked authority can quietly ruin lives." I read the court filings. "I've seen what they tried to do to you." I agreed on one condition. The story had to focus on the community, not just me. There were others who'd been harassed, fined, and manipulated, people who'd never pushed back because they didn't know how or didn't think they could. The interview happened in my backyard, with the trail gate in the background. Talia had already spoken with Brian, April, and even the zoning inspector who dismissed Margaret's false complaint. She'd done her homework. I walked her through the timeline: the false claims, the manufactured easement threat, the financial misappropriation, and ended by handing her a printed copy of the original plat map. "This was all they needed to see," I said, "but they didn't care. They thought fear would win." After the segment aired, emails flooded the HOA's general inbox, not from angry residents but from homeowners in other neighborhoods, asking how they could audit their own boards. Some even requested copies of the public documents we'd posted online. The fallout spread further than we expected. Then something happened that none of us saw coming. Talia's report triggered a broader investigation by the County Association Compliance Office, a little-known oversight agency that typically reviewed HOA registrations and financial disclosures. They announced a full audit of Ridgegrove Hills' last 5 years of filings. A week later, a city clerk named Fallon showed up at my door with a request to view trail footage from the months leading up to the dispute. I asked if something new had surfaced. "It's not about the trail anymore," she said. "We've been reviewing HOA filings across multiple neighborhoods. Your case opened a door. We found something in Ridgegrove Hills' annual reports documents that had been digitally altered. The pattern was subtle. Forged vote tallies during budget meetings, backdated approvals for spending that had never happened, even fabricated signatures on petitions." She handed me a copy of one my own name, attached to a vote I never participated in. "This signature's a scan," I said, pointing. "I never signed that, and I don't even write my last name in cursive." Fallon nodded. "We're pursuing it as forgery." "You're not the only one." Within days, subpoenas were issued for digital records, emails, and internal communications. What they uncovered was worse than anyone imagined. Margaret hadn't just misappropriated funds. She'd colluded with a private developer, one with a vested interest in acquiring land adjacent to Ridgegrove Hills, the trail behind my property. That was the final piece they needed to break ground on a small luxury extension they'd been lobbying to build for over a year. 8 high-end townhomes with direct trail access. The plan had been to pressure me into giving up the land, or at the very least, grant a permanent easement. Once that was secured, the developer would funnel a consulting fee back to Margaret under the table, disguised as a grant to the HOA for environmental beautification. The money trail was traced through 3 shell accounts. Kathy, the board treasurer, had helped funnel it. Ron, it turned out, had resigned quietly weeks earlier, not out of guilt, but to avoid being tied to the wire transfers. But it was too late. The paper trail was airtight. When the grand jury indictments were announced, the entire neighborhood froze. Margaret was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of government documents, money laundering, and misrepresentation of fiduciary responsibilities. Kathy faced similar charges, along with falsifying financial disclosures. The developer's regional rep was also arrested. His company promptly cut ties and entered a settlement, agreeing to pay a substantial fine and withdraw any future development proposals in the area. Margaret's arrest made the local news. She was led from her home in handcuffs, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses as she was escorted into an unmarked car. No one cheered. No one jeered. The silence said everything. At the next community meeting, Brian stood at the front of the clubhouse holding a stack of printed bylaws. "This won't happen again," he said, his voice steady. "We're rewriting the governing documents from scratch. Every financial decision will be public. No more unchecked power. No more lifetime presidencies. We're running this place like neighbors, not a regime." The vote passed unanimously. As a final step, the board voted to dissolve every fine issued under Margaret's tenure that wasn't tied to actual violations of law. They refunded over 20 homeowners. Joel oversaw the reimbursement process with the kind of precision usually reserved for tax audits. A few weeks later, I was asked to lead a workshop at the local library on property rights and land surveys. I agreed, under one condition. I'd speak only if the event was open to residents from all neighborhoods, not just ours. The organizer grinned and said we'd need a bigger room. The day of the workshop, I brought copies of old plat maps, aerial overlays, and a simple handout titled, "If they say it's theirs, prove it isn't." The room was packed. A woman from a different subdivision told me her HOA had forced her to tear down a storage shed that was well within her lot. She hadn't known she could appeal. She left with a list of resources and contact info for a pro bono land use lawyer Lacey had recommended. As I walked back through Ridgegrove Hills that evening, I passed a group of kids hanging paper lanterns from the trees near the old trailhead. April and her son were painting a wooden sign nearby. She waved me over. "We're calling it Carter Path now, not for ownership just because it wouldn't exist without you." I just shook my head. "I didn't do it for recognition." "I know," she said. "That's why it means something." Brian later suggested we formalize the trail's use through a private agreement, not a public easement, just a mutual understanding that I'd open it for community events when I chose to. I agreed on the spot. No contracts, just trust. Months passed. The trail stayed peaceful. The new board stayed transparent, and homes in the neighborhood, their values rebounded, not because of any one feature but because word got around. Ridgegrove Hills had become the place where neighbors stood up to corruption and won. I still walked the trail most mornings, coffee in hand, boots crunching over pine needles. Sometimes I'd pass a neighbor or two, always on my side of the fence. They'd wave and I'd wave back. Nothing more needed to be said. The forest was quiet again. And justice, for once, had roots deeper than any HOA mandate.